What's going on, guys? It's Cooper Codes, and in this video we are going to be creating this beautiful startup landing page completely from scratch. We are going to be working with Next.js, and I'm going to be using TypeScript for this build, and we are also going to be working with NextUI. NextUI is, in my opinion, one of the best React UI libraries out, and it works directly with Next.js. NextUI also has a fantastic dark mode, which in my opinion is one of the best dark modes you can get when working with React or Next.js. This video is perfect for anyone who is new to building things with Next.js. We're going to learn a bunch when creating the Navbar and also creating this large kind of Jumbotron feature here. And we're also going to learn a bunch creating these cards on the bottom, which are their own Next.js components. Let's get into the code. We can get started by using this command npx create next app at latest --ts. This is going to allow our empty folder here to create a next application specifically with TypeScript. So we can run that command. It's going to ask for a project name. I'm just going to say landing-page for this project. So once that's done, we can go into the folder we just made by going cd landing-page. Inside of here is going to be our full Next project, so all the different things you'd expect. We are then going to install NextUI on top of our Next project to give us access to all the different things we're going to need to use the interfaces from NextUI. So we can install that by saying npm install or npm I at nextui-org/react. So for this video, the dependencies are actually super simple. That is all we need to install as far as doing any npm installs is concerned. So inside of our Next application, we can go over to pages. We're going to have the underscore app here and also the index.tsx. Index.tsx is kind of the main screen we see if we were to run our application right now. In order to get NextUI working, we're going to have to go into pages and add an underscore document.tsx. This is a custom document that is defined in the NextUI documentation, and so I'm going to leave a paste bin in the description. It will say underscore document code. Just go and copy this code and bring it over to the document here. We're going to learn a bunch of cool things in this tutorial, but I wouldn't worry too much about what this is doing. It's pretty much allowing our entire application to have all the styling from NextUI. So make sure you save this document, then we're good to go. We now want to go to the underscore app.tsx file. Inside of this file, we can get started on adding a wrapper, which allows our entire application to use the NextUI dark mode. So we're going to need to import two different things from NextUI. The first one is the NextUIProvider, which provides NextUI functionality to our application, and then also the create theme, which allows us to establish a dark mode theme from at nextui-org/react. So now we can make this return statement a little bit more complicated, but we're pretty much taking this main component here, which is at the root of our application, and we can wrap the provider around this application. We can establish the provider by saying NextUIProvider like this, and then wrap it around the component like this. So any component in our application is going to have access to the NextUI styling. For example, one thing we can do is at the top here, we can define a dark theme by saying const dark theme is equal to create theme, which is provided to us from NextUI. And NextUI actually has a dark theme default we can use. So we can pass in an object and we can set the type equal to dark. So in the background, there's a bunch of predefined stylings when it comes to the type of dark for NextUI. To provide this dark theme to our application, we can go to the provider and establish the theme property equal to the dark theme. So now our application will use the dark theme when we work with NextUI, which is going to look way better. So that's all the setup we need to do for NextUI. Now we're ready to go to an actual page in our Next application and work with the NextUI components. So let's head over to index.tsx. If we were to start our application right now, we would see all of the different boilerplate from Next.js. Do yourself a favor and delete everything within this return statement. We don't need any of the initial stylings for this project. So you should have a index.tsx with a returning of nothing right now. So as we continue to build our site, we can import things from NextUI whenever we need to. For example, I'm going to have one container that's going to wrap around our entire project. So I can import container from at nextui.org/react. And so we can use a container by just using this. It's a regular JSX element like this. So I'm going to create some comments. I would encourage you guys to do similarly because it's going to help make our code look a little bit more cleaner. On the top of our application, we are going to have the Navbar, which is that little bar that shows the information. It shows like contact us, it shows login and sign up in the top right. That's what our Navbar is going to be. Then we're also going to have this thing that I'm just going to call a Jumbotron. If you've ever been to like a baseball game or something like that, it's that big screen of information at the front that says like the education platform of the future. That's going to be our Jumbotron, which is one component we have to make. Then we have 3 cards in the bottom. So 3 displaying product cards on the bottom. And so this is how our website's going to be structured, is one thing at a time. And so we can get started by creating our navbar. We can use the navbar that's created in the NextUI project by going up here and importing navbar like this. This allows us to create a navbar. A common theme with design frameworks like NextUI is that these components like containers or navbars are going to have properties which change how the component looks. For example, isCompact is going to give us a more compact looking navbar. And we can also give our navbar a variant, such as the variant of static. We can start our navbar by thinking about the left of the navbar, which is going to be that kind of brand text. So whatever the name of your website is, we can say navbar.brand like this to get access to it. Within the brand, we can also establish text. And so text is a component from NextUI itself, which we can import at the top. So we can say text, we can say B to make it bold, and we want to do a color of inherit. And you can make this whatever you want your website to show. For example, I'm going to say learn to code because I'm kind of doing a more education-based startup, as you guys saw in the beginning. And this color inherit is going to inherit the color from whatever its parent is. For example, if the navbar.brand says in our theming to be of color white, for example, it's going to inherit that color there. We're also going to have the navbar.content. These are the links that you see in the middle of the navbar that take you to different pages in the website. So we can establish a navbar link by saying navbar.link. We can point it to a certain link in our webpage, but for this example, I'm just going to do hashtags, which pretty much means go nowhere. If you guys are interested in this type of content, leave a comment below and let me know if you want to see, React routing within a project like this or a multi-page startup landing page. I could definitely do a project on that. So I'm going to have one of my links say learning platform. We can copy this whole link and make another one. It's going to say, let's see, we have a community of some sort on my website that we want them to go to. And then a classic is a regular contact us. And so NextUI has very similar breakpoints to Bootstrap. So if we want to hide the navbar content when the screen gets too small, we can say hide in equals medium to hide the entirety of the navbar content when the screen size reaches whatever we define as medium, which is a pretty cool property provided to us from NextUI. We can also provide some more navbar content at the bottom here, which we want in a different little navbar content, which is going to be the login and then the sign up buttons. So I'm going to make the login just another navbar link, which we can copy from up here. And I'm just going to make it say login. Then we can use navbar.item to apply styling to things like buttons, for example. So we can have a sign up button, which is going to be styled differently than our login. So we can go to the top and import the button from NextUI. We can go to the bottom here. So we can define the button here. We can say auto to automate how large the width of the button should be is a cool property we get from NextUI. We can also say flat, which is going to define what the button looks like and give us a more flat styling. Then we can point to the link. So for example, if you wanted to point it to a sign up page, for example, you could do that. I'm just going to point it to an empty link for now. And we can define the text here by saying sign up. So now we can go see what the navbar looks like by going into our terminal and running our next application by saying npm run dev. It should start up on localhost 3000 by default. A cool trick here is you can go into your terminal and go to localhost and you can press Control and then click localhost to jump over. All right, so we have that really amazing dark theme with the amazingly themed button over here. You'll see all these buttons are clickable, but they don't take us anywhere. I didn't make the brand clickable, but you can also just use the href on the brand if you want this to bring them to a homepage, for example. But yeah, it's looking really good. Now we can get started on creating that large Jumbotron element that's going to take up the majority of the web page. So for this Jumbotron, we are going to be using the grid from NextUI. So we can go up here and import the grid. We're also going to need the column to use within our grid, which I'll explain in a second. So one way to use the grid components is that we can make a grid.container. We can justify all the different components inside of our grid to the center of their flex rows. So we can see center right here. Just going to make everything align to the middle of our grid. We can also manually set the height and even the background image of our grid container by using CSS, which is a property given to us by NextUI. We can set the height. In this case, I think 500 pixels looks great. And although you might want to avoid using pixels in some of your projects, in this case, with the text I'm using, I know that it won't exceed that 500 pixel height and it looks good even on mobile devices. We can also set a background image by setting it equal to the URL of an image we want to use. There's this amazing website called littlevisuals.co. They're free for commercial use and they're super high quality pictures. If you're going to release a website to production, I would recommend you download these images, but just for the simplicity of the tutorial, I'm going to take some images and just manually use their links for the tutorial. For example, I found this sunset image really great, so I'm going to use this full link here. And make sure to get the full link, littlevisuals.co/images/sunset.jpg. All the images in this tutorial are going to use the littlevisuals.co, so once you type out this link once, all you have to do is change the end. I just made that convenient for you guys, so you can have some cool images and also make it relatively simple. So we can save that like this, and now we can actually run our application just to see that it's working. So you should still have that running in the terminal, but you can say npm run dev if it's not running. Let's go check it out. Amazing, so we have this Jumbotron here. It has that really cool sunset background. And because these two elements are in the same container, they're lined up perfectly on the sides, which is super cool. All right, let's get to work on creating those text elements that we want in the middle of our Jumbotron. I'm going to start by creating a grid. On the extra small size, I want it to take up the full 12 columns. And then on the small side, I want it to take up just 6 columns. I'm going to align items to the center. And this doesn't just align items horizontally, it also aligns them vertically, so your text and your buttons are going to be in the middle of your Jumbotron. I'm going to use a column here, which is going to take up the full width. So I'm going to add some CSS to say the width is 100%. So we are going to make that large text that is on our Jumbotron. It might seem like I'm adding on a bunch of random stuff to this text, but I want to make sure it looks really good because that text is on the main part of our page. So the first property you want to mess with is the weight of the text. So this is like super bold, italics, stuff like that. For example, I want to make it bold in this case. We also want to set the size. So I'm going to say size equal to 70 pixels. You can adjust the size for how you think looks best. And I'm also going to use the CSS is equal to text align of center. So this is so like if you were to imagine you're in a Word document, we want that center aligned text instead of it moving to the left, for example. And so I'm going to split up our text into two different things. The first one is the education platform. And then I'm going to copy this full text, make another line. And this next line is going to say of the future. I'm doing this because I really like how the of the future looks next. And so if we go to our localhost, I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. And so you can do a similar strategy when you're creating your own text, because when you make two different text blocks, it kind of forces an indent. So this text is going to be on its own, and so is this one. So just explaining why I'm doing that. We can also make a button, which is going to be pretty cool. I'm going to make it a medium size. So this is going to be the size of the button, of course. It's going to have a shadow, and it's also going to have a color, which is going to be equal to a gradient. By default, this gradient is going to be like a dark mode type gradient and look pretty nice by default, so I didn't change any settings there as far as color goes. For the CSS, we're going to add a width of 100%, and I'm also going to add a margin top of 10 pixels, just so it's kind of a little bit lower than the text, and so it's a little bit separated. And I'm going to say join for free. It's going to be the text of our button. So we can save that. And if you go over to our localhost, you'll see that we now have this full project, which is pretty cool. Looks good on mobile, and it also looks good when you make it full screen, for example. All right, so now we're going to get into some really interesting learning when it comes to using Next.js. We had those cards on the bottom, which were showing off different courses. It could also show off different products your startup is offering. And so we are going to go and create those components to create those cards. So outside of my pages, I'm actually going to add a different folder. And so make sure it doesn't go into your pages folder. You want to be outside of the pages. And I'm going to call it components. Within the components, I'm going to create something called an InfoCard.tsx. So this is just going to be the component for creating those cards that show off our different products. Because we're using TypeScript, we're going to have to do some specific things to create a component with types. First of all, you're going to want to import the type of next page from next. So that's from Next.js. And then we're going to want to define the InfoCard by saying const InfoCard is equal to next page. And we also want to define some props here to the next page. So this allows us to pass in properties when we create our component. Then we want to export default InfoCard at the bottom. And don't worry, we're going to fix these errors up in a second. And so because we're using TypeScript, we need to make an interface for what props are able to be passed into this next page. So we can define that interface by saying interface of props right here. And so you define this interface just like any interface you would in TypeScript. For example, we can define a title to be of string, a label to be of string, an image URL, so the background image, we can even pass that into our component with a string, and also the amount of students, for example. And I kept the student count in there just to show you can have different variables related to whatever your use case is. For example, mine's showing how many students are enrolled in a course. This info card has an error because we're not returning anything yet, so we can fix that by just returning nothing, but then we're going to want to return something here as well. For these cards, we are going to be using the card component given to us by NextUI, so we can go to the top and import card. And I'm just going to import everything we're going to need here. We're going to need the text component. We're also going to need rows and columns, and also the button as well. That's all going to be from @NextUI/React. And before we even do any coding, I'm just going to explain this real quick, is because we know that our props is defined as an object like this, we can get all the different variables out of this props object by saying const, and then the name of the properties we want. For example, the title of the card, the label that we want to show on the card, the image URL of the card, and also the student count of the card are all going to be coming from the props object that we pass in. So that's pretty cool. That's how you get properties when using Next.js with TypeScript. So let's get started building our actual card component to show off these different things. So we can say card like this, and cards allow us to define a header in the card. So card.header like this. We want the CSS to be of an absolute position. So we can say CSS is equal to position absolute, and we can say top of 5. This allows us to show the header relative to wherever the card is. So we just know if the card's in a certain spot, just put the header a little bit under the top of the card. So the top 5 is adding some space to the top of our header. We can then create a column within our header to hold all of our different contents. For example, in this column, we are going to have 2 different text elements. The first text element is going to have a size of 12. Its weight is going to be bold. We're going to have a transform equal to uppercase, which is a really cool way of just making everything in your text uppercase no matter what. And then this color is defined in the documentation for NextUI. So it's $FFFFFFF AA. And so it's a really cool kind of gray looking color. So pretty much 6 Fs and then 2 double A's there. And this is going to be that label which is above our thing. So for example, in my example, this says like course or something. If you're a blog or something, it could say article, it could say new product, whatever you want it to say. Then we can make another text, which, you know, you guys need to learn all about all these different properties, but this one's nice and easy. We can make it an H4 element by saying H4, and the color is going to be equal to white. And that's going to have our title, which again, we're getting from the properties. So I'm going to pause for a second and go back over to our index.tsx. I'm going to make a grid container to hold all of our different cards. So I'm going to say grid.container. I'm going to give it a gap of 2 just so we have some space so cards aren't like directly next to each other. That's what that gap of 2 is allowing us to do. And I'm going to make a grid element for every single card. When we are on a very extra small screen, we want a card to take up the full width of the columns. But if we're on a larger screen, we want to take up, one of 3 columns. It's kind of what you guys saw on that initial website. So 12 is going to take up the full thing. So you're going to have like 3 stacked on top of each other. But when a grid takes up 4 things, that means it's going to kind of say 4, 4, and 4 is going to take up your full 12 columns. And so we can use the info card here, and React is going to actually import that for us. So if we go to the top, make sure you import info card from components/info card like this. This is going to give us access to the component we're creating. And the info card is going to require some properties. And when we have a bunch of different properties like this, I like using this syntax where we use a single component with a closing right after it. And we can add in the properties one at a time. So for example, the label is equal to a course, and the title is equal to a, let's say, learn Next.js with Cooper codes, I believe I said, which you guys are doing, so congrats. And I'm going to use an image URL. If you don't want to type out the image again, you can grab this URL over here, paste it in right there. And for this one, we are going to be using the red_don.jpg, which is just another image from Little Visuals. And I'm going to set the student count equal to 3,500. And so now that we have all the necessary properties, InfoCard is going to be green, which is great news. And so before we can see the info card, let's hop back over to InfoCard.tsx. Right now, since this header is using absolute positioning, there's no actual content here, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. We can add the main content of the image, which is going to be card.image, to the bottom here. Its source is going to be equal to that image URL that we're passing in. This is going to allow our text to write on something, for the image for example, and you guys will see when I load this up. Let's hop over to localhost. Boom, so we actually have that full card, as you guys can see, and it's loading in the different properties, which is super cool. It's saying course, it's saying learn Next.js Cooper codes, and now we're going to add that kind of stuff to the bottom that's showing the amount of students and also a link to go to whatever you decide this panel to be. So let's work on that. So that is called the card.footer is what we're working with there. We can use this really cool property, which is my favorite property about NextUI, is we can use the isBlurred. This allows us to add a blur to the bottom of our card footer. And so we can even specify the CSS of this blur by saying CSS is equal to a position of absolute, a background blur that's going to be equal to, again, this is something that was defined in the documentation, which looks nice. So just copy this, $0f111466. It's going to give us a really clean looking background blur. And we're going to set that position absolute. So we needed to tell it that we're going to go to the bottom of the element and pretty much sit directly on the bottom. So we're going to give it a property of 0. Cool. So within this card footer, we can make a row. And so this row is going to have two different columns to hold some different items. For example, the item on the left, which shows the amount of students, which I will say in call like this. Then we can define that text by saying text. And this color is something that looks nice on the blurred background. It's going to be D1, D1, D1. And for my case, I'm going to use size of 18. And so we can use that student count that was a property that we got defined above and set to say students in this example. You could say like how many thumbs up an article has, whatever you guys want to do for your project. But for me, I'm saying how many students. Then I'm going to make another column here. And so this was a cool way of showing off how to make some customized text inside of a button is how I found this. And so you can make another row and set as justify equal to flex end. So we're going to create a button first, and then we're going to create text after. So we're going to say button, flat, auto, rounded, which means it's going to be rounded button, and set the color equal to primary. Then inside of this button, we can use some text as well. And by the way, this flex end is also bringing this row to the very right of its column is how that button's getting shoved to the right. And so we can define a pretty complicated text here, but I'm just going to say enroll in course. So it's kind of that button to the side. And now we can define the CSS here. And again, when we use a bunch of different properties, we can do this kind of syntax where we have one property on each line. For example, the CSS is going to be of color inherit. So it inherits that primary color. Size is going to be equal to 12. Weight is going to be equal to bold. And again, we see that transform equal to uppercase. So it makes all the different characters uppercase. And there we go. Just to explain this again, we are going to have a row that's going to sit on the bottom of our card. The first column, so it's going to be to the left of the row, is going to show the amount of students. Then we have this other column, which is being shoved to the right of that column, is this row on the inside. And once everything is shoved to the right, we are creating a button with unique text styling inside of it, and then we're closing that button off. And so let's go and look at our application in localhost. Amazing. So we have this really cool text here, amazing image in the background, and we see how many different students and also enroll in course. So to fully complete our website, we can actually use this component 2 more times to fill out the rest of this grid. So let's go do that. So we can go into index.tsx here, make sure in the bottom where we're displaying those product cards, and we can take each grid element and pretty much copy it over. Now we have 2 total cards showing. I'm going to create this label, keep it the same, but let's say I want to teach you guys Apollo server over on this one, for example, and let's just say people don't like Apollo server as much. I'll have 1,000 total students on this one. I'm also going to change this to the sunset.jpg, so just take that same image URL and just change it to sunset. We can then make another component here. I'm going to say create a startup with Cooper codes. I don't know if I could teach you guys that, but you never know. And let's say everyone wants to make a startup from this video, so I'm going to set it to equal to 5,000 students. And I'm going to use the tail.jpg provided to us from the littlevisuals.co. So make sure to save that index.tsx, and let's go over to our localhost. Amazing. So trusting in the grid is really helping us out because trusting that those grid elements worked, we were able to just take this component we already created and copy it over 2 more times, which is super amazing. And so you can even make this go to a smaller screen, for example. Still going to say education platform of the future, and you can scroll through and still see all this content, which is super cool. You can also have it on the super large screen here, which kind of gives like a more Netflix effect. And it looks pretty cool and pretty modern. If you guys are interested in more Next.js content, I know I'm going to be working with Apollo server and Next.js and TypeScript in the future. So if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe and like the video. I know all the YouTubers say it, but especially if you made it this far, it really does help out the channel. So thanks so much. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching.